They called her the Giant of Junction City. A curse, some whispered. A monster, others said behind cupped hands. When she walked by, men would look away and women would pull their children close, as if her size was a sickness you could catch. But 4-year-old Annie didn't see a monster. She saw hands big enough to lift her to the highest apple on the tree. She saw arms strong enough to carry her all the way home when her little legs gave out. She saw eyes that were tired and sad, but looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. So when the little girl looked up at the giant woman everyone else had thrown away and asked the one question that would change everything, it wasn't just a moment, it was a reckoning. Because sometimes the biggest hearts are hidden in the biggest people, and the smallest voices, well, they speak the loudest truth. The snow hadn't stopped in 2 days. It fell not like a blanket, but like a shroud, covering the world in a silent, unforgiving white. The train platform at Saddle Creek was empty, a ghost town of frost-covered benches and wind that bit to the bone. Everyone who had somewhere to go was already gone. Everyone except her. Susanna sat hunched on the farthest bench, her worn satchel clutched in her lap like a lifeline. The fabric of her dress was stiff with ice, clinging to her legs. Her feet, tucked inside boots with holes in the soles, had lost all feeling hours ago. Her shoulders, broad and powerful, were curled inward, a posture of shame she'd practiced her entire life. Nobody had come for her. The man who wrote the letters, the one who promised a new life, who called her his sweet prairie angel, had taken one look at her as she stepped off the train. Just one look. He hadn't even said her name. He just mumbled, "This has to be some kind of joke," and vanished back into the swirling snow. She didn't run after him. What was the point? She knew. She'd seen it in the way the other passengers went quiet, the way they shuffled back to give her space, their eyes a mix of pity and disgust. She'd felt it her whole life, the curse of being too much, too tall, too wide, too present. A person who took up more space than the world was willing to give. But knowing didn't make the cold blade of rejection any less sharp. She hadn't eaten in a day. The station master had grumbled something about arrangements gone sour, not being his problem, and locked himself in his warm office. She was alone, except for the men on the other bench. There were 3 of them, their laughter loud and ugly against the whisper of the wind. They'd been drinking, and they hadn't stopped staring at her since her intended had fled. It wasn't just curiosity in their eyes. It was something else, something hungry and cruel. One of them nudged his friend. "Got nowhere to go, that one." Another one chuckled, a wet, gravelly sound. "Bigger than my prize sow. Bet she's warm, though." The third one stood up. He was older, with a beard caked in ice and eyes dulled by cheap whiskey. He swaggered toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. "You lost, sweetheart?" he slurred, a smirk twisting his lips. Susanna tightened her grip on her satchel. She didn't speak. Her throat felt frozen shut. He took another step, looming over her. The smell of whiskey and unwashed wool filled the air. "I said, are you lost? Or just waiting for a man who took one look and ran for the hills?" She finally looked up, her voice a raw whisper. "Please, leave me be." He threw his head back and laughed, a harsh bark that echoed in the empty station. "You're sitting here alone, freezing to death. Looks to me like you could use a man's company to warm you up." He reached for her. "Or maybe," a new voice cut through the air, calm as ice and sharp as a razor, "you could learn what the word no means." The drunk froze, his hand hovering in the air. A man emerged from the blur of the snow. He was tall, his broad shoulders covered by a heavy coat dusted in white, his jaw set like granite. Cradled in one arm was a small child, a little girl with wide, sleepy eyes peeking out from a woolen hood. She was clutching a worn, stuffed lamb. The drunk Brant slowly raised his hands. "No trouble here, Colt. Just making conversation." "You're always trouble when you drink, Brant," the man named Colt replied, his voice dangerously low. "Now back off." Brant hesitated for a second, his whiskey-fueled courage warring with a primal fear. Fear won. He grumbled something under his breath and shuffled back to his friends, who had suddenly found something interesting to look at in the bottoms of their bottles. The wind howled, erasing their footprints. Susanna didn't move. She just stared at the man standing before her. He was another giant in his own way, carved from the same hard country as the mountains that loomed in the distance. Colt McCrae stepped closer. He saw her eyes. Frightened, yes, but not broken. There was a strength in them, a resilience forged in a lifetime of cold stares and colder shoulders. This wasn't a damsel in distress. This was a survivor who was finally at the end of her rope. He knelt slowly so as not to spook her, shifting his daughter in his arm. "You can't stay out here. This storm, it'll kill you." She didn't answer. Her lips were blue with cold. So he did something that shocked her more than any insult. He shrugged off his own heavy coat, the thick wool still radiating his body heat, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The sheer, unexpected kindness of it made her gasp. Then, before she could find the words to thank him, or to refuse, he did something even more unbelievable. He gently placed his daughter into her arms. "She's warm," Colt said, his voice softer now. "You hold her for a minute. I'll get the horses hitched." The little girl, Annie, didn't cry. She didn't shrink away. She just looked up at this enormous, strange woman, blinked her big brown eyes once, and then snuggled into Susanna's chest like she'd been doing it her whole life. A sound escaped Susanna's throat, a strangled sob of disbelief. It had been so long since anyone had leaned into her warmth instead of flinching away from it. So long since she had held something so small and precious. Her huge, work-roughened hands instinctively cradled the child, protecting her from the wind. The coat smelled of pine smoke, leather, and snow. The child smelled of vanilla and sleep. For the first time in days, Susanna felt something other than cold. Colt returned with a sled pulled by two powerful horses, their breath misting in the frigid air. He helped her to her feet. She stood, a towering figure wrapped in his coat, holding his child, her own meager belongings slung over one shoulder. She must have been a strange sight. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. She hesitated, her own name feeling foreign on her tongue. "Susanna." "Susanna," he repeated, nodding once. "I'm Colt. This here is Annie." As if on cue, Annie looked up at her, a small, sleepy smile on her face. Then in that clear, certain way only a child can speak, she said, "Can you be my mama?" The world stopped. The wind died. The snow held its breath. Colt froze, his hand on the sleigh. Susanna's heart, which she thought had turned to a solid block of ice, suddenly cracked. The child said it again, a little softer this time. A statement, not a question. "Mama. I want her to be my mama." Tears, hot and painful, welled in Susanna's eyes. She didn't answer the little girl. She couldn't. She just bent her head and pressed a trembling kiss to Annie's forehead. Then she followed Colt to the sled, her legs moving on their own. The ride through the small town of Saddle Creek was silent, but the stares were deafening. Faces appeared in frosted windows. Curtains twitched. They saw the town pariah, the grim widower, Colt McCrae, riding with a giant of a woman clutching his child. They saw and they whispered. Colt didn't seem to notice or care. He gripped the reins, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the darkening path that led up into the mountains. Susanna kept her head down, shielding Annie with her body, holding on to the child as if she were the only thing keeping her anchored to this earth. The sled turned away from the town, climbing toward a lone cabin nestled against a ridge, toward the first real warmth she'd felt in years. Behind them, the whispers grew into a storm of their own. But Susanna was beginning to understand that the real storm wasn't the one raging outside. It was the one brewing inside the heart of a woman who had spent her life being told she was too much and was now for the first time being asked to be everything. And as they rode into the growing darkness, she glanced back at the town. From a window in the sheriff's office, she saw a man's silhouette watching them go. The feeling she got wasn't of safety. It was the chilling sense that she hadn't been rescued from the fire, but had just been tossed into the furnace. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and strong soap, a clean, honest smell that seemed to scrub the filth of the train station from her memory. When Colt pushed the heavy door open, a wave of warmth washed over Susanna, so profound it was almost painful. It seeped into her bones, waking up places that had been cold for years. Annie stirred in her arms, her small cheek pressed against Susanna's shoulder. "You can put her down in the green room," Colt said, his voice a low rumble. He nodded toward a short hallway. "It's warmer in there." Susanna walked carefully across the creaking floorboards, her steps heavy and uncertain in this new space. The room was small, just big enough for a cot and a small chest, but the quilts piled on the bed looked soft and clean. A lantern cast a gentle golden light on the walls. She laid Annie down, tucking the blankets around her tiny frame. The child sighed in her sleep, one hand still clutching her stuffed lamb. Susanna lingered for a moment, her hand hovering over Annie's curls, a strange ache blooming in her chest. Back in the main room, Colt had poured a mug of what smelled like coffee and placed it on the rough-hewn table. He didn't look at her, just gestured toward it with his chin. "You need to eat. I'll make some stew." "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Please, let me." He looked at her then, his eyes searching her face. He gave a short, sharp nod and stepped aside. She moved around the small kitchen like a trespasser, her large frame feeling clumsy and out of place. She found the pot, the dried meat, the shriveled potatoes, her hands calloused and capable from a lifetime of hard labor, fumbled with the small utensils. She knocked a tin of salt from a shelf, the clatter echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. She whispered apologies for every noise she made, for the space she took up, for her very existence. Colt said nothing. He sat at the table sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the silence. The stew burned. She had meant to watch it, to stir it, to keep the fire low. But her mind had drifted. What was she doing here? This man, this stranger, had shown her a moment of kindness. But what did it mean? Tomorrow, when the storm passed, would he send her away, just like the other one? Would the town's cruel whispers poison his mind? The smell of smoke, acrid and bitter, snapped her back to the present. What in God's name? Colt's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze of her thoughts. She spun around in horror, grabbing the pot off the stove, but it was too late. A plume of black smoke billowed out. The meat was charred, the broth a bitter, blackened mess. I, I'm sorry," she stammered, her face burning with shame. I forgot." "You'll burn the whole damn cabin down if you keep forgetting," he snapped. He strode to the stove, yanked open the door to the firebox, and a rush of cold air swept through the room, carrying the smoke with it. Susanna flinched as if he'd struck her. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, backing away. He didn't answer, didn't even look at her. He just stared into the fire, his back a rigid wall of anger. She couldn't breathe. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating. She turned and fled, out the door, into the biting wind and the deep snow. Her thin shoes slipped, and she stumbled, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She ran until she reached the barn, the big wooden doors a dark shape against the white landscape. She collapsed into a pile of hay, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. She had tried. She had tried so hard to be useful, to be quiet, to be less of a burden. But it was never enough. She was always too much, and never good enough. The snow tapped softly on the tin roof above her. The wind moaned around the corners of the barn. The horses shuffled in their stalls, their soft snorts the only other sound. She sat there for what felt like hours, shivering not from the cold, but from a shame so deep it felt like it was hollowing her out from the inside. Then she heard it, a small soft sound, a knock. She froze. It wasn't on the main barn door. It sounded like it came from the side wall. She slowly stood, brushing the hay from her skirt, and peered around a stack of crates. Nothing. Just the endless, swirling snow. Another knock. This time she realized it wasn't coming from the barn at all. She turned and looked back toward the cabin. The door to the little green room, Annie's room, was standing open. A small figure stood silhouetted against the lantern light, a nightgown fluttering in the breeze. It was Annie. In one small hand, she held a single, slightly crumbled shortbread cookie. "I saved you one," she said, her voice a soft murmur on the wind. Susanna just stared, her throat tight. Papa yells a lot, Annie said, stating it as a simple fact. She took a small step forward, her bare feet sinking into the snow. He yells more when he's scared, but he likes it when people stay. The words hit Susanna harder than any insult, harder than any fist. They were a truth so simple and so profound they knocked the air from her lungs. The little girl walked the rest of the way, her arms outstretched, and wrapped them around Susanna's legs in a fierce hug. The cookie crumbled between them, falling unnoticed into the snow. Susanna sank to her knees and finally truly cried. Not the loud, broken sobs of before, but a deep, quiet weeping that came from a part of her heart she had thought was long dead. It was the sound of a frozen river finally breaking apart in the spring. That night she didn't sleep on the cot. She slept on the floor next to Annie's bed, one hand resting on the little girl's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. Annie had curled toward her in her sleep as if she'd always been there. And as Susanna drifted off, she heard a different sound from outside. Not the wind, the steady, measured crunch of boots in the snow, pacing back and forth. She crept to the frosted window and peered out. It was Colt. In his hands he held a rifle. He wasn't just a rancher, he was a sentinel, guarding his home against a threat she couldn't see. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the danger here wasn't just a burnt stew or a stranger's anger. It was something older and far more deadly. The morning light was pale and thin, filtered through the frost on the windows. Susanna woke with a start, the floorboards cold beneath her. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar room a stark reminder of her precarious situation. Then she saw Annie, still sleeping peacefully, and a fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed surged through her. She rose quietly, pulled the thick wool blanket up to Annie's chin, and stepped into the main room. The cabin was cold, the fire having burned down to glowing embers. Colt was gone. A note was propped on the table, his handwriting sharp and angular. Checking the fence line, don't burn the place down. The words stung, but underneath the gruffness, she sensed something else. A warning. He wasn't just checking fences. He was patrolling. Determined, Susanna set to work. She stoked the fire, her movements sure and steady now. She boiled water for porridge, stirring it slowly, carefully, refusing to let her thoughts wander. She found a broom and swept the hearth, folded the laundry that hung drying by the stove, and brought a quiet order to the chaotic little cabin. It was work she understood, a rhythm she could lose herself in. Colt returned mid-morning, a blast of cold air following him inside. Snow clung to his shoulders and the brim of his hat. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The table was set. The fire was burning calmly. The cabin, instead of smelling like smoke and tension, smelled of cinnamon and coffee. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice low. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I wanted to," she replied simply, then softer. "It's the least I can do for your kindness." He just nodded, but she saw the tight lines around his eyes relax. Just for a second. It was a tiny crack in the armor, but it was there. Later that afternoon, while Colt was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat against the silence, Susanna decided Annie needed a bath. She heated water on the stove, pouring it into a small metal tub, testing it with her elbow until it was just right. The little girl, who had been quiet and watchful all morning, came alive. She giggled and splashed, her delighted shrieks echoing in the small cabin. It was a sound of pure joy, a sound Susanna suspected hadn't been heard within these walls for a very long time. Outside, the axe fell silent. Colt stood by the woodpile, listening. He set the axe down and walked to the cabin window, peering through a clear patch in the frost. He saw Annie, her hair plastered to her head, laughing as she slapped the water. And he saw Susanna kneeling on the floor, her sleeves rolled up her massive arms, a gentle smile on her face as she hummed a soft, tuneless melody. He didn't smile, but he didn't move away. He just watched, his expression unreadable, as this strange giant woman brought laughter back into his silent home. That night, after Annie was asleep, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. Susanna stood by the stove, drying her hands on a scrap of cloth. "She asked me if I was going to stay," she said quietly, her back still to him. Colt looked up from the saddle strap he was mending. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know. He nodded slowly, his fingers stilling their work. She doesn't talk much. Not to most folks. Not since, not since her mama died. The words hung in the air between them. Susanna finally turned and sat at the table across from him, the lantern light casting long shadows on her face. Her eyes looked raw, vulnerable. I came out here because I thought someone wanted me, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I thought maybe, for once, I could belong somewhere. But the man who wrote me, he said I was a joke. He said I was too big, too loud, that I looked like I'd scare the horses. Colt's hand clenched around the leather strap. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. Then, without looking up, he spoke, his voice a low growl. There ain't nothing wrong with being scared, Susanna. It just means you still give a damn about what happens next. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a savior, not as a threat, but as a man who understood pain and wasn't afraid to look it in the eye. She went to bed that night feeling a sliver of something she couldn't name. Not hope, exactly. It was too fragile for that. But it was something. When she woke the next morning, her torn dress, the one that had been ripped and muddied during her ordeal at the station, was lying neatly folded at the foot of her cot. The seam was mended. The stitches were thick and uneven, the work of a man's clumsy, powerful hands. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't asked. He had just seen a hurt and quietly, without any fanfare, fixed it. Not because she was weak, but because he saw that she mattered. The storm outside had long since passed, but the one inside Susanna's heart was just beginning to melt. She spent the next few days exploring the edges of her new reality. In the cabin, she found more signs of a life interrupted. In a dusty chest, she found a woman's clothes, neatly folded, smelling of lavender. They were small, delicate things. In the back of a cupboard, she found a single child's drawing of three stick figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands under a smiling sun. The woman's face had been violently scribbled out. The discovery sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just a house of grief, it was a house of anger. One afternoon, searching for extra blankets in the barn loft, her hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Curiosity overriding her caution, she pried it up. Tucked beneath it was a small, leather-bound diary. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine. Elara's. She knew she shouldn't read it, but she couldn't stop herself. The first few pages were filled with talk of the ranch, of her love for Colt, her joy in their daughter Annie. But then the tone shifted. Silas was in town again today, one entry read. He says Colt doesn't appreciate what he has here. He says a woman like me deserves more than this wilderness. The name Silas appeared again and again. Silas Blackwood, the town banker. He'd brought Alara gifts. He'd whispered promises of a different life, a life of comfort in society. The final entry was short, the handwriting jagged and hurried. Silas knows about the papers. He knows I found them in his ledger. He's not what he seems. He's a thief. I told him I would tell Colt. He laughed. He said Colt would never believe me. He said he would take care of it. I'm scared. I have to hide them. I have to. The entry ended there. Susanna slammed the diary shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't an accident. Elara hadn't just fallen. She had been silenced. She was about to put the diary back when something fell from between its pages. It was a small, ornate key, a key to a safe deposit box, perhaps. She tucked it into her pocket just as she heard Colt's boots on the gravel outside. She scrambled to replace the floorboard, her hands trembling. Had he seen her? That evening, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colt was quiet, his mood darker than usual. He kept watching her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. You were in the loft today, he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. I was looking for blankets, she stammered. Stay out of the loft, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. There's nothing up there for you. But there was, and now she knew it. She had stumbled into the middle of a secret that had gotten Colt's wife killed. And now, that same secret was circling this cabin like a hungry wolf. She looked from Colt's hard face to Annie, playing quietly by the fire, and she knew she couldn't run. Running was no longer an option. She was in this now, and the key in her pocket felt as heavy as a gravestone. The snow began to melt, but the stairs in town only grew colder. By the second week, the whispers had become a story, a sordid tale repeated with righteous glee over mercantile counters and in the church pews. "Shacked up with that killer, Colt McCrae," one woman hissed, yanking her child away when Susanna reached for the same bolt of fabric. "Heard she was a mail-order bride somebody else sent packing. Guess a man like Colt can't be too picky." "Poor thing. She'll probably end up at the bottom of the same ravine as his wife." Susanna tried to build a wall against the words. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her voice a murmur. But the hatred followed her. It was in the way the store owner counted her change twice, the way men stepped off the boardwalk into the mud to avoid passing her, the way children would point and then run. She stopped going to town unless she absolutely had to. Colt never spoke of it, but she saw the way his jaw tightened when they rode past the saloon, the way his hand would drift to the pistol on his hip. He heard the whispers, too. He lived in their poison every day. The breaking point came on a Saturday. They needed feed, and there was no putting it off. Annie was perched on Colt's hip, her face buried in his shoulder, while Susanna waited by the sleigh. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. Silas Blackwood strode out of the bank. He was a handsome man, dressed in a fine wool coat, his silver hair gleaming in the pale sun. He was the picture of civility and success. He saw them, and his smile was a predator's baring of teeth. He walked directly to Colt. "McCrae," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "Good to see you out and about. And this must be your new companion." His eyes raked over Susanna, lingering on her height, her plain dress, his lip curling in a faint sneer. "You always did have a taste for the unusual." Colt's body went rigid. "Stay away from me, Blackwood, and stay away from her." Blackwood chuckled, a low, patronizing sound. "Just being neighborly. A man in your position needs all the friends he can get, especially with the sheriff still asking questions about poor Ilara. Tragic what happened to her. So clumsy." He let the word hang in the air, heavy and sharp as an axe. Then he tipped his hat to Susanna. "Ma'am." He walked away, leaving a trail of silence behind him. Everyone on the street had heard. It wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a public accusation. That night, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The unspoken things between them had grown into a monster that filled every corner. Susanna knew she had to leave. She wasn't helping him. She was a liability, another shadow for the town to point at, another weapon for men like Blackwood to use against him. She waited until Annie was sound asleep, her small face peaceful in the lantern light. She packed her few belongings back into the weather-worn satchel, the mended dress, the apron. She left the coat Colt had given her folded neatly on the cot. She slipped out the door, the cold air a shock to her system. Shame was a fire in her belly. She didn't know where she would go, only that she couldn't stay. She couldn't be the reason he lost everything else. She had just made it to the fence line when his voice cut through the darkness. "Where do you think you're going?" She spun around. He was standing on the porch, a silhouette against the light from the cabin. "I have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm making things worse for you. For Annie." "Worse than what?" he asked, walking toward her, his boots crunching on the melting snow. "Worse than being alone? Worse than a town full of vultures waiting for me to fail? They think you... They think..." She couldn't say the word. "I know what they think," he said, his voice hard. "They've thought it for 2 years. Your being here doesn't change that." He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "But your being here, it changed other things." He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. "This cabin was a tomb, Susanna. I was just a ghost haunting it. You brought the light back in. You made Annie laugh again." His voice cracked on his daughter's name. "I'm not letting that go." Tears streamed down her face. "But Blackwood, he's trying to destroy you." "Let him try," Colt growled, "but he won't do it by running you off." He gently took the satchel from her hand, his grip firm. "You're not leaving. This is your home now, if you'll have it." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more primal, more important. It was a declaration of allegiance. He was choosing her, this broken, giant woman, to stand with him against the world. She didn't speak. She just nodded, unable to form words. They walked back to the cabin together, side by side. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was following him. She felt like she was standing with him. But as she stepped back into the warmth of the cabin, she knew the battle wasn't over. It had just begun, and she was no longer a bystander. She was a soldier. And in her pocket, the key to Ilara's secrets felt like the trigger of a gun waiting to be pulled. The question was, did she have the courage to pull it? 2 days later, the world tilted on its axis. It started with a small, dry cough from Annie's room. By nightfall, it was a raging fever. Her cheeks were flushed a terrifying, mottled red. Her eyes glazed over, her breath coming in shallow, rapid gasps. Colt paced the cabin like a caged animal. "I'm getting Doc Rigsby," he said, grabbing his coat. "You'll never make it," Susanna said, her voice tight with fear. She held a cool cloth to Annie's forehead. The child didn't even flinch. "The pass is pure ice after that thaw and freeze. You'll kill yourself trying." "Then what do we do?" he roared, his desperation echoing off the wooden walls. "We just sit here and watch her die?" "No," Susanna said, her voice dropping to a steely calm she didn't know she possessed. "We keep her warm. We get liquids in her. We fight, and we pray." And so they fought. For 2 days and 2 nights, the small cabin became a war room. Susanna did not sleep. She bathed Annie in lukewarm water to bring the fever down, then wrapped her in blankets when the chills set in. She coaxed tiny spoonfuls of broth and water between the child's cracked lips. She stoked the fire relentlessly, the heat in the cabin becoming a suffocating blanket, sweat dripping down her own face. Colt was a shadow at her side. He chopped wood, hauled water, held Annie's small body when Susanna's arms began to tremble with exhaustion. He was silent, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes never left his daughter. The fear in them was a raw, open wound. On the second night, Annie began to whimper in her delirium, tossing her head back and forth. "Sing to her," Colt said from the doorway, his voice hoarse. "Her mama used to sing to her." Susanna's throat was tight. She didn't know any lullabies. So she sang the only thing that came to mind, a simple, sad hymn from her own childhood, her voice low and wavering at first, then growing stronger as she poured all of her fear, all of her desperate hope, into the simple melody. She sang for hours. She sang until her voice was gone, until the sun began to bleed gray light into the sky. Dawn came. The fever hadn't broken. Susanna sat by the bed, her body numb with fatigue, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Annie lay terrifyingly still in her arms. It was the awful, quiet end of the battle. Then a flicker. Annie's eyelashes fluttered. Her eyes, still cloudy with fever, focused on Susanna's face. "Mama," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama, you stayed." The word, the simple, beautiful word, shattered the silence. Colt stumbled forward from the doorway, his knees nearly buckling. He knelt by the bed, reaching out a trembling hand, but Annie just snuggled deeper against Susanna, a tiny, contented sigh escaping her lips. Colt looked at Susanna, his eyes swimming with tears he refused to let fall. I never taught her to call you that," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Susanna's own tears began to fall, hot and silent, dripping onto the blankets. "You didn't have to," she whispered back. In that moment, everything changed. They weren't a man, a woman, and a child anymore. They were a family forged in the crucible of fear and hope. The fever had broken, and something new, something powerful and unbreakable, had begun. Later that day, when Annie was sleeping peacefully, her fever gone, Susanna knew it was time. She walked to Colt, who was staring out the window, his shoulders slumped with relief. She held out her hand. In her palm lay the small, ornate key from Alara's diary. "I found this," she said quietly. "In the barn. I think it's important." Colt stared at the key as if it were a venomous snake. He looked up at her, his eyes a storm of conflict, anger, suspicion, and a dawning respect. "What else did you find?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Her diary," Susanna said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I know about Blackwood. I know he was threatening her. I think, I think he killed her, Colt." He didn't deny it. He didn't rage. He just closed his eyes, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "I have no proof," he whispered. "The sheriff. He's in Blackwood's pocket. It's my word against his." "Maybe not," Susanna said. She pulled the diary from her own pocket and opened it to the last, frantic entry. "He knows I found them in his ledger. I have to hide them." She hid the proof, Colt, and I think this key is where we start looking. The storm outside was over, but the hunt had just begun, and now they were hunting together. The key was for a lockbox at the bank in Silver Creek, the next town over. A town where Silas Blackwood wasn't a king. The problem was getting there. Colt was a marked man in Saddle Creek. He couldn't just ride out without raising suspicion. Blackwood and his cronies were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. "They're expecting me to do something," Colt said, pacing the cabin floor. "They'll be watching the roads, the trails. If I ride out, they'll follow." "Then you don't go," Susanna said, her voice firm. He stopped, turning to look at her. "What?" "They're watching you," she repeated. "A man riding alone heading east. But they aren't watching me." "Not really. To them, I'm just the giant woman, the housekeeper, an inconvenience. They won't be expecting me to make a move." He stared at her, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He was seeing her not just as a comfort or a mother to his child, but as an ally, a partner. "It's too dangerous, Susanna." "What's more dangerous?" she shot back. "Sitting here waiting for Blackwood to make his next move? Waiting for him to decide we know too much and burn this cabin to the ground with us inside it? No. The most dangerous thing we can do right now is nothing." She was right. He knew it. The plan was simple and terrifying. Susanna would take the morning supply wagon into Saddle Creek, just as she'd done a few times before. But instead of returning, she would buy a ticket on the eastbound stagecoach, pretending to be leaving for good. Once in Silver Creek, she would use the key, retrieve whatever Ilara had hidden, and take the night stage back. Colt would stay with Annie, creating the illusion that everything was normal. The morning of her departure was thick with tension. Susanna dressed in her plainest dress, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She knelt by Annie's bed and kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead. "Be brave for your papa," she whispered. Colt met her at the door. He didn't say, "Be careful." He didn't say, "I'm scared." He just pressed a small, heavy pistol into her hand. "It's loaded. Point and pull the trigger. Don't hesitate." Her fingers closed around the cold steel. "I won't." He then pressed the key into her other hand, his fingers lingering over hers for a moment. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a universe of trust, fear, and a desperate unspoken plea. "Come back, Susanna." "Always," she whispered. The ride into town was nerve-wracking. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. At the mercantile, she bought flour and beans, her movements slow and deliberate, playing her part. She saw Brant, the drunk from the train station, watching her from across the street. He was one of Blackwood's men. He spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt as she passed, his eyes cold and empty. At the stagecoach office, her hands trembled as she bought her ticket. "One way," she said, her voice louder than she intended. The clerk barely looked up. The stagecoach was crowded and smelled of stale sweat and wet wool. She squeezed her large frame into a corner seat, keeping her head down, her satchel clutched tightly in her lap. Inside it, the pistol was a heavy, cold reality. The coach lurched forward. As it rumbled out of town, she risked a glance out the window. She saw Brant hurry into the telegraph office. He was letting Blackwood know she was gone. The thought sent a spear of ice through her veins. They hadn't been fooled. They were letting her go. They were letting her lead them right to the evidence. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was a trap, and she was the bait. The journey to Silver Creek was the longest 4 hours of Susanna's life. Every bump in the road, every shadow on the trail made her jump. She clutched the satchel, the weight of the pistol a grim comfort. She knew she was being followed. She couldn't see them, but she could feel their eyes on her, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. When the stagecoach finally pulled into the dusty main street of Silver Creek, she felt a moment of relief, quickly followed by a fresh wave of fear. This was it. The Silver Creek Bank was a small, unassuming stone building. She walked in, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the clerk could hear it. She presented the key, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fit it into the lock of the deposit box. The clerk opened the metal door. Inside was a single, thick envelope sealed with wax. Alara's initials were pressed into it. Susanna grabbed it, tucked it deep inside her satchel, and walked out of the bank, trying to appear calm. She had it. Whatever secrets Alara had died to protect were now in her hands. She had 2 hours until the return stage. She found a small cafe, ordered a coffee she couldn't drink, and sat at a table in the back, her eyes scanning the street. She needed to see what was in the envelope. She needed to know what she was risking her life for. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. Inside wasn't just a ledger, it was a stack of papers. There were bank statements showing huge sums of money being transferred out of the accounts of local ranchers and into an account under a false name. There were deeds, forged with uncanny skill, transferring ownership of land and water rights to a holding company owned by Silas Blackwood. He wasn't just a thief, he was systematically strangling the life out of the entire valley, buying up land from desperate men he himself had ruined. But there was something else tucked at the very back. It was a letter, not from Elara, but to her. The handwriting was messy, desperate. Elara, you have to get out. He knows you know. He's not just a banker, he's a killer. He did the same thing back in Missouri. People who got in his way just disappeared. My brother was the sheriff there. He got too close, and they found him at the bottom of a ravine. They called it a riding accident. Please, for your daughter's sake, run. It was signed J. Miller, the sheriff of the neighboring county. He had tried to warn her. Susanna felt sick. This was bigger than forged deeds. Blackwood was a serial predator, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. And Alara hadn't just stumbled upon a financial crime. She had uncovered a monster. A shadow fell over her table. She looked up into the cold, dead eyes of Brant. He wasn't drunk now. He was sober and infinitely more dangerous. Two other rough-looking men stood behind him, blocking the door. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards," Brant said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "He'd like his property back now, the papers, and the woman who was stupid enough to go looking for them." The cafe was empty except for the terrified owner, who was slowly backing away, his hands in the air. Susanna's mind raced. The stagecoach was her only way out, but they would be watching it. She was trapped. She slowly pushed her chair back, her hand inching toward the opening of her satchel. "I don't know what you're talking about." Brant laughed. "Don't play dumb. It doesn't suit you. Now give me the bag, or we can do this the hard way. I don't mind. In fact, I'd prefer it." He took a step forward. Susanna's hand closed around the grip of the pistol. Colt's words echoed in her mind. "Point and pull the trigger. Don't hesitate." She stood up, her full height towering over him. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to make herself smaller. She embraced her size, her strength. She let him see the giant he thought she was. "You're going to have to take it from me," she said, her voice a low, steady growl. Brant's smile faltered for a second. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a frightened, clumsy woman. He hadn't expected a cornered grizzly bear. "Your choice," he snarled, and lunged for her. He never made it. In one swift, powerful motion, Susanna swung the heavy wooden chair she'd been sitting on. It caught Brant square in the chest with a sickening crunch. He flew backward, crashing into one of his men. The third man, stunned for a second, drew his gun. But Susanna was already moving. She upended the heavy table, sending plates and coffee cups crashing to the floor, creating a makeshift barricade. A gunshot exploded in the small room, the bullet splintering the wood of the table next to her head. She didn't hesitate. She ripped the pistol from her satchel, just as Colt had taught her. She didn't aim. She just pointed it over the top of the table in the direction of the gunman and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but the sound of the blast was followed by a scream of pain. She risked a glance. One of the men was on the floor, clutching his leg. Brant was struggling to get to his feet, dazed. The third man was reloading, his face a mask of fury. She knew she had seconds. She didn't run for the front door. She ran for the back. She crashed through the flimsy kitchen door, sending the terrified cafe owner scrambling out of her way. She burst out into a back alley, her lungs burning, her heart about to explode. She could hear them shouting behind her, coming after her. She ran, her big body surprisingly fast, her long legs eating up the ground. She didn't know the town, didn't know where she was going. She just ran, turning down one alley, then another. The damning papers clutched in her satchel, the smoking pistol still in her hand. She was no longer the victim. She was no longer the bait. She was the messenger, and she had to get this message home, or die trying. Susanna ran until her lungs were on fire, and her legs were screaming in protest. The alleyways of Silver Creek twisted into a confusing maze of trash bins and wooden crates. She could hear Brant and his men behind her, their curses echoing off the brick walls. They were gaining on her. She ducked behind a stack of empty barrels, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Trapped. There was a high wooden fence at the end of the alley. No way over it. Her heart sank. This was it. This was where they would find her. Then she saw it. A fire escape ladder, rusted and rickety, running up the side of a tall brick building. It was a crazy idea. A woman of her size. It would never hold her, but it was the only chance she had. She holstered the pistol back in her satchel and lunged for the ladder. The metal groaned in protest under her weight, but it held. She began to climb, her hands and feet finding purchase on the cold, narrow rungs. Below her, Brant and his men skidded to a halt at the end of the alley. They saw her, a giant silhouette against the gray sky, and for a moment they just stared in disbelief. "Get her!" Brant roared, and one of his men started firing. Bullets pinged off the brick wall around her, sending chips of mortar flying. One whizzed past her ear so close she could feel its heat. Fear gave her a fresh surge of adrenaline. She scrambled upward, faster now, the satchel banging against her back. She reached the roof just as Brant started to climb the ladder after her. She didn't look back. She ran across the flat, tar-covered rooftop, leaping across the narrow gap to the next building. The roof was a patchwork of different levels and obstacles. Chimneys, vents, skylights. She looked over the edge. She was 3 stories up. The street below seemed a world away, and in the distance, she could hear the whistle of the stagecoach. The last coach back to Saddle Creek. It was leaving. Panic seized her. She was going to miss it. She was going to be stranded here, hunted. She ran to the edge of the roof that overlooked the main street. The stagecoach was just beginning to pull away from the station, the horses picking up speed. It was now or never. She saw a pile of canvas sacks and old ropes on the roof near her. An idea, born of pure desperation, flashed in her mind. She grabbed one of the thick ropes, looped it around the base of a sturdy chimney, and prayed it would hold. She slung the satchel securely over her shoulder, took a deep breath, and swung out over the edge of the building. For a terrifying second, she just dangled in the air, the wind whipping at her dress. Then she began to rappel down the side of the building, her heavy boots scraping against the brick, her calloused hands burning from the friction of the rope. People on the street below stopped and stared, pointing, their mouths agape. She was halfway down when she saw the stagecoach rumbling toward her. It was going to pass right below her. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Stop! Wait for me!" The driver saw her, his eyes wide with shock. He pulled back on the reins, the horses rearing up in confusion. Susanna let the rope slide through her hands, her descent accelerating. She landed on the roof of the stagecoach with a jarring thud that shook the entire carriage. She'd made it. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, the precious satchel clutched to her chest. Then she heard a roar of rage from the rooftop above. Brant was there, at the edge, his face contorted with fury. He raised his pistol to fire. "Go!" Susanna screamed at the driver. "Go now!" The driver didn't need to be told twice. He cracked his whip, and the horses bolted. The stagecoach lurched forward, throwing Susanna against the luggage rack. Brant fired, but the shot went wide. The stagecoach careened down the main street and out of town, kicking up a cloud of dust. They were away. She had the evidence. She had survived. As the buildings of Silver Creek disappeared behind her, she finally allowed herself to collapse onto the roof of the coach, her body screaming with pain and exhaustion. She had done it, but a cold dread began to seep into her relief. Blackwood now knew for certain that she had the papers. He knew she was on her way back to Colt. He wasn't going to let this stagecoach reach Saddle Creek. The fight wasn't over. He would be waiting for them somewhere on the long, dark road home. The ride back was a blur of adrenaline and dread. Susanna made her way down from the roof at the first stop, startling the other passengers, who stared at her mud-streaked, torn dress and wild eyes. She ignored them, taking a seat inside, the satchel never leaving her lap. With every mile that passed, the tension grew. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody shades of orange and purple. The shadows grew long, and every rock, every tree, looked like a man with a gun. She knew they wouldn't attack on the open plains. They would wait for the narrow pass through the canyons, just a few miles outside of Saddle Creek, a place with nowhere to run. As the stagecoach began its slow climb into the rocky canyon, the driver grew nervous, glancing from side to side. The passengers fell silent, sensing the danger. Susanna's hand closed around the pistol in her satchel. Her heart was a slow, heavy drum. It happened fast. A large tree, freshly felled, blocked the road ahead. The driver pulled hard on the reins, bringing the coach to a screeching halt. And then they were there, figures emerging from behind the rocks, rifles in their hands. It was Brant, his face bruised and swollen from the chair she'd hit him with, and four other men. They surrounded the coach, their faces grim in the fading light. "Everybody out!" Brant yelled. "Nice and slow!" The passengers began to file out, their hands raised in terror. Susanna stayed put, her mind racing. This was it. There was no escape. Brant ripped the coach door open and saw her. A slow, vicious smile spread across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here. I knew you wouldn't make it easy. Now give me the bag." "You'll have to kill me first," Susanna said, her voice steady. "That can be arranged," he snarled, raising his rifle. A gunshot echoed through the canyon, but it wasn't from Brant's rifle. One of Brant's men crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Everyone froze. From the ridge above them, a figure rose from behind a rock. It was Colt. He held a rifle, and its barrel was smoking. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him was the sheriff of Saddle Creek, his face grim, a shotgun held at the ready. "Drop your weapons, Brant," the sheriff yelled, his voice booming through the canyon. "It's over." Brant stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sheriff, what are you doing? You're with us." "Not anymore," the sheriff said, his voice laced with disgust. "I may be a lot of things, but I'm not a party to murdering women and children. I followed you from town. I heard everything." He had reached his breaking point. Blackwood had pushed him too far. For a moment there was a tense standoff. Then another shot rang out from the ridge. Another of Brant's men went down. It was Colt, firing with deadly accuracy. Chaos erupted. Brant and his remaining men dove for cover, returning fire. The passengers screamed and scrambled for safety. Susanna didn't wait. She burst out of the coach on the opposite side, using it for cover. "Colt!" she screamed, holding up the satchel. "I have it! It's all here!" This was what Colt had been waiting for. He and the sheriff laid down a volley of covering fire, pinning Brant's men down. "Susanna, run!" Colt roared. "Get to the trees!" She ran, stumbling over rocks, her lungs burning. Bullets whizzed past her, kicking up dirt at her feet. She dove behind a large boulder just as a bullet slammed into the rock where her head had been moments before. The firefight raged around her. It was a desperate, brutal battle in the twilight. She could hear Colt shouting, the sheriff yelling, the crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls. Then she heard a cry of pain. It was Colt. She peered around the rock. He was on one knee, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. The sheriff was trying to hold off the remaining two men, but he was outnumbered. Brant saw his chance. He broke cover, making a mad dash for Susanna and the satchel. His eyes were wild, crazed. He was a cornered animal. He was almost on top of her. Colt was too far away, too injured. The sheriff was pinned down. She was alone. She raised her pistol, her hands shaking. Brant was a huge, terrifying figure, bearing down on her. "Don't hesitate." She fired, once, twice. Brant stopped, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at his chest, where two dark circles were rapidly expanding. He looked back at her, a look of pure disbelief on his face. Then he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The last gunman, seeing his leader fall, threw down his rifle and surrendered to the sheriff. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the whimpering of the passengers and the ragged sound of Susanna's own breathing. It was over. She scrambled over to Colt, who was now leaning against a rock, his face pale. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against his wound. "You came," she whispered, her voice choked with tears of relief. "Always," he whispered back, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I told you I would." The sheriff rounded up the prisoner and the bodies, his face grim. He looked at Susanna, then at the satchel in her hand, and finally at Colt. "You were right about Blackwood all along, McCrae," he said, a newfound respect in his voice. "Let's go finish this." They rode back into Saddle Creek not as outcasts, but as victors. The stagecoach carrying the wounded Colt, the exhausted Susanna, and the evidence that would bring down a tyrant was an unlikely chariot of justice. The final act played out in the center of town. The sheriff, with Colt and Susanna at his side, strode into the saloon where Silas Blackwood was holding court, laughing with his cronies. When he saw them, Blackwood's smile vanished. When he saw the satchel in Susanna's hand, his face went white. The sheriff threw the forged deeds and incriminating letters onto the table. "Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Alara McCrae." Blackwood tried to run. He never had a chance. Colt, despite his injury, slammed him against the wall, his one good arm pressing against the banker's throat. "This is for my wife," he growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. Justice, swift and final, had come to Saddle Creek. The snow melted for good that year, giving way to a spring so vibrant and green it felt like a promise. The ranch came back to life, and so did the little cabin on the ridge. The silence was replaced by the sound of Annie's laughter, the rhythm of Susanna's humming, the steady, reassuring presence of Colt's footsteps on the porch. The town, humbled and ashamed, began to change. People who had once crossed the street to avoid them now tipped their hats. Women brought pies and loaves of bread as peace offerings. They had misjudged Colt, and they had grossly underestimated the giant woman who had become his rock. Susanna was no longer the frightened outcast from the train station. She was the woman who had faced down gunmen, who had saved their town. She walked with her head held high, her shoulders back, no longer ashamed of the space she occupied in the world. She belonged. One warm evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Colt took her hand and led her to the edge of the pasture, where wildflowers were blooming in a riot of color. "I thought my heart was buried with Alara," he said, his voice soft. "I thought this ranch was all I had left to fight for. But I was wrong." He turned to face her, his eyes full of a love so deep it took her breath away. "You, Susanna, you are what I was fighting for. You and Annie, you're my home." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He had spent the long nights of his recovery whittling it for her. "I'm not a man of fancy words," he said, placing the bird in her palm. "But I know this. I need you. Annie needs you. Marry me, Susanna. Be my wife. Be her mother. For real this time." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." A tiny figure came running across the pasture, a fistful of daisies clutched in her hand. "Mama! Papa!" Annie yelled, barreling into them. Susanna scooped her up, and Colt wrapped his arms around them both, holding his family tight. Under the vast open sky, with no preacher and no witnesses but the mountains themselves, the McCrae family was finally, officially, whole. Years later, Susanna found the old satchel in the back of a closet. Inside, faded and creased, was the letter from the man who had called her a joke and left her to freeze. She took it out to the fire pit, Colt's arm wrapped securely around her waist. She watched as the paper curled, turned black, and disappeared into ash, taking the last ghost of her old life with it. Love hadn't saved her that day at the train station. Courage had. Love had just been smart enough to show up, recognize a miracle when it saw one, and stay for the ride. If this story reminded you that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the places the world has overlooked, if you've ever felt like you were too much or not enough, then don't let this moment pass you by. Hit that subscribe button and share this story, because the most important battles are often won by the quiet warriors, the gentle giants, and the people who refuse to believe they are anything less than exactly who they were meant to be.